Hello and welcome back to Only Nirvana. I thought I'd do the voiceover myself this time instead of using AI. Some of you don't seem to like the AI, so I thought I'd give this a try. And I'm going to be looking at MechWarrior 5 clans today. Let me warn you in advance, performance is quite poor on this game, especially on lower tier cards. You can see I've got the RTX 3050 8GB and AMD RX 6600 running here. Neither one is delivering a very good experience. In fact, it's rather piss poor. You're getting over 30 frames per second on the average frame rates, but minimums are dropping down into the low teens or even single digits on the 3050. It's really bad. If you move up to a higher tier card like the 4060 or 7600 XT, average frame rates do improve a lot, but at least on the 4060, those minimums are still terrible, hanging out in the mid-teens. You get 51 frames per second on average, but drops down to 14 frames per second. Who's going to want to play that? AMD 7600 XT with 16GB of memory, twice as much as the 4060, does better, but it still has minimums of 28 FPS. Still very not good. And I'd blame Unreal Engine 5, but really it's on the developers, Piranha Games. They need to do better at optimizing their game for the engine and get it up to snuff. Moving up to the RTX 4070 and the 7900 GRE from AMD, performance is much better, especially on the AMD card. We're getting nearly 100 frames per second, and on the Nvidia we're getting about 80 frames per second. AMD clearly has the advantage here. It's a rasterization game, so that's expected, but also because of having more memory and more memory bandwidth, that seems to be a critical factor in performance, with the 4070 dropping below 50 frames per second on the minimums compared to nearly 80 frames per second on the 7900 GRE. But do note, we're only running 1080p medium settings. I mean, we can go higher and we shall. But first, let's look at the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX. These are two of the fastest graphics cards around, and the performance of the XTX is quite good, but again at 1080p medium. We're getting 124 frames per second, minimums of about 100 frames per second compared to 110 frames per second on the 4080 Super and 80 FPS on the minimums. We've also got the higher tier RTX 4090 that we can look at. It's supposed to be the fastest card around right now, but it's not. We're getting 121 frames per second with minimums of 86 frames per second. Those are both worse than the 7900 XTX, and it speaks to a general lack of optimizations and tuning. The game seems to want you to use upscaling and frame generation to get a decent experience, and I really dislike that. I don't want to use upscaling unless I have to, and I shouldn't have to if I've got a 4090 or a 4080 Super or a 7900 XTX for that matter running at 1080p medium. I shouldn't need to use those things on a 4060 either, but apparently in MechWarrior 5 clients you do. Let's go ahead and step up to maximum settings. The game doesn't have any presets, so on medium I just set every setting to medium, and on maximum I set everything to maximum. The 4060 and 7600 XT really take a nosedive now. We're getting under 30 frames per second even at 1080p max settings, with minimums again dipping into the low double digits. 10 FPS on the 4060 and 14 FPS on the 7600 XT. Ouch. If you have a faster graphics card like the 4070 or the 7900 GRE, 7800 XT would probably be closer to the 4070, but it also costs less, so that's why I'm comparing these two cards. Look at the 4070, 46 frames per second on average, but you're getting drops into the upper teens, low 20s. That is, again, terrible. The 7900 GRE does better, minimums of 41 frames per second when I'm not recording, but if you look at the video here, you'll see that there was just a dip down into the 20s, so it does vary as you play the game. Even the high-end cards don't provide an amazing experience. 7900 XTX getting 75 frames per second compared to 70 frames per second on the 4080 Super. These are cards that cost $1,000 depending on where you live. I mean, they cost a lot more down under, It's not something that I am very happy with seeing on a new game like this. A 4080 Super should not struggle and fall below 60 frames per second unless it's just got some very poor programming and shaders. And last we have the RTX 4090 taking on AMD's 7900 XTX. The 4090 does end up being faster, but not by a lot, especially considering it costs nearly twice as much. And it's probably going to be even worse than twice as much once the RTX 5090 comes out next year. That's it for 1080p max settings. Here's the overall charts. Everything lines up mostly as you would expect. The main problem being these low FPS values and low minimums, especially on anything from the 4070 and below. Getting sub 20 frames per second dips, that is just a really sluggish experience. Which means naturally if you kick up to 1440p max settings, things are going to get even worse. We're starting with the 4060 and 7600 XT. I really don't have much to say about these two cards. 20 FPS on the 7600 XT, 14 FPS on the 4060. Yeah, you're going to need to lower resolution, use upscaling, or use framegen in order to get something playable at 1440p. If you have a higher tier card like a 4070 or 7900 GRE, that still might not be enough. The 7900 GRE gets 40 frames per second, but minimums of 26 frames per second, and the 4070 can't even get up to 30 frames per second with minimums of 14 frames per second. You can use upscaling and framegen to get a better experience, but those should not be a base level requirement to get playable performance. Even the RTX 4080 Super and 7900 XTX, they can't hit 60 frames per second. And yes, you're in a big stompy mech going around the battlefield, and so you don't need like 400 frames per second or whatever, but when you're getting below 60 on these super expensive cards, that's hard to stomach. Even the RTX 4090, it gets above 60 frames per second, but minimums dip down to 50. It's faster than the 7900 XTX by not as much as we're used to seeing. Let's go ahead and look at our chart, and things are pretty much as you'd expect. The 4080 Super is closer to the XTX now, and the 7900 GRE has a commanding lead over the 4070. This indicates VRAM issues and other things are at play. Whatever the cause is, Piranha Games, they need to do better and go back and fix their engine, fix their game, make it run well. Naturally, if 1440p was doing that badly, you can't expect too much from 4K. Native rendering, we're getting 10 FPS on the 4070 and 23 FPS on the 7900 GRE. That's a pretty big step up to the GRE, and what I find is it looks like the game is mostly bandwidth limited, which is really weird. I don't know why that would be happening. Maybe it's shader problems that they're just written to use so much memory bandwidth, because what you'll find is when I bump up to the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX, the 7900 GRE outperforms the 4080 Super. That just should not be happening. The XTX and the 4080 Super, it's an easy AMD win. I'm just going to go ahead and skip up to the next level of the RTX 4090 and the 7900 XTX because again, this is weird. We're getting the same frames per second, around 30 frames per second on these two cards. They both have 24 gigabytes of memory on a 384-bit memory interface, so roughly the same bandwidth, roughly the same performance. I haven't seen this much of a bottleneck that appears to be memory bandwidth related in a game in an awfully long time, and I have to think Piranha Games did something weird and they should go back and relook at their code, run some optimization and investigation tools to figure out what's causing the slowdowns. Here's the overall chart. Like I said, 30 FPS on the 4090 and XTX, 23 FPS on the GRE and 4080 Super, and the 4070 is down at 10 FPS. But let's see if we can fix that with the way it's meant to be played apparently and turn on frame generation and upscaling. We're using quality mode, so this should be 1440p upscaled to 4K, and then frame generation does have an effect. What I find though is that AMD's FSR3.1 frame gen seems to be really doing little for the minimum FPS while it helps the average FPS. We're starting with the 4070 and the 7900 GRE because the lower cards don't really make sense. You'll see them in the charts. We're getting 42 FPS and 63 FPS, so AMD still has a commanding advantage, but minimums 22 FPS on the GRE and 18 on the 4070. That's a lot closer than the average FPS, and when we kick up to the 7900 XTX and 4080 Super, you'll actually see that AMD, while it has an advantage in average performance, its minimums are worse. So framegen isn't doing what it's supposed to do. It's not doubling the lower FPS. It's keeping that about the same while the average goes way up, and that provides a pretty poor experience again. And if we go up to the 4090, we see the same thing. 4090 is getting almost 100 frames per second at 4K with upscaling and framegen, so it actually feels quite good and playable, and the extra lag from framegen doesn't actually even feel that bad because you're in a big stompy mech, so when you turn fast, well, the mech doesn't turn fast, it takes some time. It actually feels maybe even more realistic, you could say. Minimums on the 4090 are 66 compared to 30 on the XTX. So here's our final chart. As you would expect, 4090 is on top, but only by a little over 10%, so definitely not the normal 30% advantage you would see at 4K. That indicates that there are other things rather than just compute holding back performance in MechWarrior 5 clans. I hope you liked this. Thanks for watching. Please give me a thumbs up, get the bell on, and you guys have a nice day. We'll see you next time.